Cool. All right. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I've seen some familiar faces there, but there's some I don't know as well. So my name is Dan, and I'm really happy to be able to join you guys this morning. So my wife, Sarah, and I, Sarah's actually on the screen there as well, Sarah's iPhone. Hi, Sarah. So we grew up in Ottawa together, and we moved to Dunham in Quebec here back in 2009 to work with Youth with a Mission. And so we're both artists. I'm a photographer and a musician and a writer, and Sarah's a fantastic artist as well, doing painting and drawing especially. And we actually came to Dunham to work with Youth with a Mission, and specifically with a program that works with artists. We wanted to be part of getting training ourselves, but also training Christian artists to grow in their craft, but also in their understanding of who God is, their relationship with Him, and then to be able to combine those things together to share their faith and their heart with communities both here in Quebec and around the world. So we've been doing that now for, since 2009, so got to do some quick math here, 12, 13 years. And it's just been an awesome experience. And so it's been a really wonderful joy to see how God's been moving in different nations around the world that we've been able to go to. And see how He's been working in the lives of different artists that we've been able to hang out with as well. Actually, this morning, one of the worship songs was from a band named Impact, and one of the bass player actually did one of his trainings with us at Youth with a Mission Dunham, so it was fun to see him there as well. So yeah, it's great to just see what God's been doing. But I must say, with the different travels and things we've done, what I've been most excited about, especially over these last years, is just how God is moving in La Belle Province, in Quebec. And so it's really a pleasure to be with you guys here today. I know for Sarah and I, we've definitely fallen in love with Quebec, both its French and its English cultures, which are very much a part of who they are and the beauty that this region has to offer. And so we've been thankful to call this place home for the last 13 years. And so, yeah, we had the privilege of having Eric come and share with us at the Village Church in East Farnham. So my wife and I have been attending there for over the years at different times. And so it was really great hearing from him, and I have the privilege of, through Youth of the Mission, having been able to work and meet people like Selassie and Jean-Éric and Samuel and Gretchen too. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful privilege, and so we're very thankful to be hanging out with you guys today on Zoom together. So it's cool, I would love to be together in person. I think everyone does. But, it's cool that we can be joining each other from one another's living rooms. We can be showing hospitality to each other from our own homes as we do so. So it's cool to have a little glimpse in that way. But I wanted to talk today about pursuing friendship with Jesus. So, I was just thinking about friendship and friendship with God and what that means and what that could mean for each one of us. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about lots of different friends I've had as well in my life. But there was one quote I really loved that I kind of was reflecting on this past week, and it's by a woman named Helen Keller. So for those of you who know or may not know who she is, Helen Keller was a woman, and she's well known. She was both blind and deaf, and so she had this wonderful teacher who worked very closely with her in her life, helping her discover the world. Because to discover the world when you both can't hear or see definitely creates a challenge. It creates a challenge for connection, a challenge for growing in friendship with others, and just for understanding, who you are in your context. But Helen Keller said one time, she said, "I would rather walk with a friend in the dark than alone in the light." And I thought that was pretty, powerful words coming from someone who never has seen anything a day in her life. She was born blind and deaf. But I thought that spoke just something beautiful about the connection and the importance of relationship, the importance of friendship, the importance of community in that regard. And so as I was thinking about friendship, and as I was thinking about friendship with God in particular, I was just thinking about the friends I have in my life and what it is about their friendship that is so significant to me. And as I thought about it for myself, I was really thinking about, friendship for me, at least in my case, is really about knowing that the other person has my back. That they're there for you, whether it's difficult times, easy times, no matter what, you know and you can trust that, that person has your best interest at heart and they're looking out for you. And, that knowing and that assurance of that comes through experience. as I spend time with friends, and as they have shown me over and over again that they're there for me, that they're ready to help me, it gives me more confidence and trust that that is the case, and it becomes easier to trust and just more natural to do so. But I was thinking, one of the challenges we have when we're talking about a relationship with Jesus and relationship with the Lord is that it can seem a little bit abstract. We can find ourselves a little bit like Helen Keller in the sense that, she couldn't see or she couldn't hear. And so we're talking about the importance of having a relationship with someone that we can't always see the way we're used to seeing. Someone that we can't necessarily touch the way I'm used to touching a friend as I give them a hug or, as I feel their hand on my shoulder just encouraging me or strengthening me. We're talking about having a relationship with someone that, we can't necessarily always hear the way we're used to hearing. I think about one of the ways that I grew in love with my wife Sarah was, all of those three things, being able to see her and see how she reacted to the world around her or to myself, to have times and moments where we could touch one another, hold hands, or just experience things together, and to hear one another as well, to hear what she had to think and say, and to hear her, words of comfort and encouragement for me and advice too. So they're all significant things. And so, I think, how is it that we can trust or have faith that Jesus has our back in this relationship? And I think it's a good question to ask, and it's maybe a question we ask often, maybe not. I know for me in my life, it's a question I've asked at different moments. And I think one of the reasons for it is because we often talk about in church and in Christian circles how important our relationship with Jesus is, which I 100% agree with. But at least for me in my life, because I was always like, this is so important and this is so basic, sometimes I forgot to ask questions about it. What does it look like to have a relationship with Jesus? Not just go and have some time with him on your own, but how do I do that? How do I experience time with him? What does it look like to be in connection and to be in fellowship with him? Especially when it's someone that I can't always, like I said, see or hear or touch in the way that I would with other friendships or other relationships I have in my life. So this has been a burning question in my life for a long time, and as we've worked with Youth of the Mission and as we've been involved in mentoring and discipling young Christian artists who have some of those same questions, as we've been encouraging them to go and share about the good news of Jesus Christ with others and encouraging others to enter into fellowship and into relationship with Jesus, it's been a question that I often find myself asking. And, I think the Bible has some really helpful things to help us understand what that dynamic or what that relationship can be like. So in Hebrews 11, verse 1 to 2, it says, it's a chapter that many of us, have grown up hearing. If you've grown up in the church, it's this wonderful list of all these amazing people of faith. And the chapter starts off by saying, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancient people were commended for, these ancestors of our faith, people like Abraham or Moses. They had confidence in what they hoped for, and assurance of what they could not see. And so I love that verse because right away I can identify, right? That's what we were just talking about. How do I have relationship? How do I have trust in this relationship with someone that I can't necessarily see? And so they're talking about faith and hope in the matter. The Apostle Paul, later on in Romans, he writes and he says, for in the gospel of righteousness, the righteousness of God is revealed. And it's a righteousness that comes by faith. From first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So it's this idea of a righteousness, a relationship with God that comes through faith. Just like it was for the ancients that was described in that previous passage. Paul goes on to say, a little bit later in the same book in Romans, in chapter 4, he says, what does Scripture say? It says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then Paul goes on to say that, therefore the promise comes by faith. And so he's talking about the promises that God gave to Abraham, the promise to make of him a great nation, to give to this man who had no children, not only one child, but thousands upon millions of children, this idea that a whole nation would come from him. And that nation and that those people would be a blessing to all the families of the earth is what it says. So this is the promise that we're talking about here in Romans chapter 4. I know you can't see my slides, I think, so I'm talking about Romans chapter 4, verses 16 to 25, in case you want to follow along. And so Paul says, therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace, it may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offsprings, not only those who are of the law, but also those who have the faith of Abraham. So in this way, Abraham is a father to all of us. As it's written, he's been made a father to many nations. And he's our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. And then Paul goes on to say things like, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. So again, it's this idea of what is it that Abraham is holding on to here? What is it that made Abraham so convinced of God's love for him, God's commitment to him, this understanding that God had his back, when he was someone that maybe he couldn't always see or couldn't always touch or couldn't always hear in the way that we would be accustomed to in any other relationship we have. And so against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so he became the father of many nations, just as it has been said to him, so shall your offspring be. And it goes on to say in verse 19, it says, without weakening in his faith. He faced the fact that though he was old, and Sarah, his wife, was also old, that this promise of children would come. And it says he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. So I love these words about Abraham. Against all hope he believed. Or against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, without weakening in his faith, without wavering through unbelief. He was strengthened in faith, and he was persuaded that God had power to do what he said he would do. And so, the question sometimes I think about is, what is it that Abraham, or how was it that Abraham was so unwavering in his trust and in his faith in this God, that he could not always see it, he could not always hear, or that he could not always touch? Because, Abraham had to take some big steps of faith himself in this relationship. As God promised him things or as God called him to places, he went in faith and obediently. But how was it that he was so unwavering, in this trust? And I think the author of Hebrews gives us a good little glimpse into that. And in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 to 20, it says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, so it's the promise I was talking about before, the promise of many nations, of children coming to this barren couple, Abraham and Sarah. When God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And so Abraham, having waited patiently, he obtained the promise. And it says, for people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath or a promise is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. And then it says, so that by two unchangeable things, in one in which it's impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. And then the author goes on to talk about how this hope is like an anchor for our soul. And so, we follow in line with Abraham here, and we can say, well, how can we trust, how can we have this unwavering faith that God is really for us, that God has our back? Well, it says here that what helped Abraham was that God confirmed this promise by an oath. Now, in the context of the story, you can take a look at Genesis 15 to get a little bit more of a word-for-word glimpse. But in context, it's talking about Abraham's covenant that he made with God, or rather the covenant that God made with Abraham. And it was this oath, it was this promise sealed by covenant that gave Abraham that assurance, that unwavering faith, and that trust that God would really do what he said he would do, that he did have his back. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, well, what is covenant? It's a pretty important word for us as Christians. And so what is it, and what's its purpose? So the word covenant, it appears approximately 300 times in the whole Bible. And it's all over the place, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so it's a pretty central theme in Scripture. In fact, even our Bible, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. The word testament is diakoni. I'm very bad with the pronunciation, but it's the Greek word for covenant. So we talk about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So even the way that our Bible is split up is this word covenant showing up. And it really becomes a very core and central feature for us in our understanding of the kind of relationship God wants to have with us in the Bible and what it looks like to live out that relationship. So to give a brief idea, the Hebrew word for covenant is this word called berith, And basically, it means a formal, a solemn, a very binding agreement. And it was usually a written agreement or a promise sealed between two or more parties, maybe individuals or groups of people. And it was for the performance of some kind of action. Now, the promise or the action that was there, it was something that was mutually agreed upon from both people or from both parties concerned. And what's interesting about the Hebrew word for covenant is it's this Hebrew word berith, as I was saying, which means to cut. So you might think this is a funny word for, associating with making a deal or making, a promise. In fact, in English, we'll talk about cutting a deal. It kind of comes from the same idea. But it's this idea of cutting. And the reason why that was significant is what the covenant partners would do is they would take an animal, they would cut it in half, and they would lay the two parts, kind of making a little aisle between them. And it was a pretty messy business, so the blood would kind of flow, and spill in between the two pieces of the animal. And what they would do is the covenant partners, or the people making covenant, they would take one another's hand, and they would, having made these promises to one another, they would take one another's hand, and they would walk through this little alleyway of the spilled blood from the animal that was sacrificed. And what they would do is they would sometimes walk around in like a figure 8 kind of formation, just kind of walking back and forth through the blood. And essentially what they were saying was, if I am not faithful to covenant, may what happened to this animal happen to me. So it was a very solemn, very binding agreement that was there. And so this is why the word cut, is part of the Hebrew understanding of covenant, to cut a covenant. It was pretty serious stuff. It wasn't just making a deal and we'll see if it happens and maybe it won't work out. It wasn't a contract, but it was this really binding thing for life. If I'm not faithful to you through covenant, or if you're not faithful to me through covenant, may what happened to this animal, this split open animal, happen to me. And so it was a very assuring compact that was made between people. So when God is making a covenant with Abraham, in Genesis 15, we see this playing out. We see Abraham, he cuts these two animals, or he cuts a series of animals in half, and he's waiting for his covenant partner, God, to show up and to walk through the blood with him. And actually, the amazing thing about the story with Abraham is Abraham falls asleep. He's waiting for God for so long, I guess. Like, he seems to fall asleep. And then, I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you feel like you're waiting for God for something, and you're just, when's it going to come, But so maybe this was Abraham's experience, but in any case, he was waiting for a while, and then he fell asleep. And eventually he woke up, and what was significant was he saw something incredible. Now, he saw two images. He saw a smoking pot, it says, and a flaming torch. And as he looked, he saw both of these items, or these images, moving through and passing through between the pieces of the animal, passing through the blood. And why this is significant, just in and of itself, as a little side note here, is, Abraham was expecting to be the one to hold God's hand and walk through the blood. And what happened was he wakes up and he sees that, God has manifested himself in two ways. And God is walking through the blood, which is significant because essentially God is telling Abraham, listen, I'm going to take both sides of the responsibility. You can just be this observer and benefit. I'm going to walk through the blood on behalf of me, saying, Abraham, if I'm not faithful to you and to your descendants, may what happened to this animal happen to me. But I'm also going to walk through the blood, this other kind of item, and I'm going to represent you, Abraham. And so Abraham, even if you and your family are not faithful to covenant, may what happened to this animal happen to me. So God took all the responsibility and all the of this agreement on him. And so Abraham had this incredibly assured position in front of God. He thought, wow, this God is really serious about his desires for me and his promises for me. And so, covenants was a common practice in the ancient Near East, and so for the Hebrew people. And so they were often made between individuals, covenants of friendship, or, just a different, even business contracts sometimes would be sealed in covenant that two individuals would continue to work for one another or help one another out. Covenants would be made between tribes and nations, so like peace treaties, alliances, things like that would often have a covenant ritual attached to it. And covenants were often also made between a king and his subjects to establish kind of a national law or constitution. They would make covenant together. The king would say, I would protect you and care for you as my people as long as you as my people follow these sets of laws. And so they would agree upon them together and establish covenant. And so it's pretty significant because when God is making covenant with Abraham, I like to think of it as God speaking the pop culture language. He's speaking to Abraham in a way that he would already understand. Using this idea of covenant to really help Abraham feel assured, because that's really what he wanted to do. That's what we read before in Hebrews. He wanted to convince Abraham that he was for him. And so what could he do to convince Abraham so that Abraham could have this unwavering trust, have this unwavering faith? He said, well, I'm going to, enter into an agreement that Abraham is pretty familiar with. It's happening all around him and the peoples and tribes around him. I, God, am going to enter into covenant with him and will seal my fate to his. This must, give Abraham the confidence. And in fact, it did. It gave Abraham the confidence to walk out into all the promises and things God called for him, and to take the full responsibility that God had given to Abraham to take. And it was an amazing part of their friendship. And so it's for no reason that in James it says that Abraham was a friend of God. Abraham understood this solid covenant that was made between him, and he had assurance that God had his back because he had promised it. He had gone through this whole ceremony. He had bound himself to Abraham and Abraham to God. And so the purpose of a covenant is really two people becoming one. Now, in the ancient Near East, there was all kinds of protocols for how they would make covenants, or steps, if you want, for covenant making. And whether a covenant was being made between individuals or groups, or between a king and his subjects, like I was telling you about before, oftentimes all, or certainly most of these covenant steps would be involved in, or these protocols would be involved in the process of making covenant. So I'll just show them to you here quick. There's one that I wanted to focus on today with you, because I think it will perhaps give us some tools and some helpful things that we can think about in our relationship with God. But there was often pre-ceremony activities, which kind of involved, inviting someone to enter into covenant with you, where you would agree on the terms together. There was the cutting of the covenant sacrifice, which we just talked about. Oftentimes, a step or a protocol that would happen as parties were making covenant together was what I would call the exchange of robes and belts and weapons, or armor even, and we're going to look at that in a second. There would be a time where they would pronounce blessings and curses on one another, and basically what they were saying is if you follow what we've said in covenant, if you adhere to those things, then you'll be blessed, but if you don't, you'll be cursed. In fact, we see this in the book of Deuteronomy. There's a famous chapter in chapter 28 where it's talking about the blessings and curses that God made with Israel as they entered into covenant together. There was often the seal of the covenant mark. So for the Jewish people, that was circumcision. But different tribes or different nations would have different ways of sealing covenant. Sometimes it was making a tattoo or something, so they would cut their arm and put some dirt in it, and it would the tattoo would show, I made covenant with this person. This is his family symbol or whatever, which is one of the reasons why it was instructed to the Jews not to tattoo themselves, because they had already entered into covenant with God and were sealed in that relationship. They would exchange names. We're pretty familiar with this in a wedding. Still today, when I got married to Sarah, she took on my family name. So it wasn't a full exchange because I didn't take on her name. That's just not how it kind of works in our culture and custom. But it gives you the sense, or the same idea, that Sarah became Sarah Hall rather than Sarah Russell. And then they would share a covenant meal together. And this is actually what we see Jesus doing with his disciples when he inaugurates the new covenant. He has this Last Supper with them that we're familiar with, and see in all kinds of awesome paintings and things like that. So these steps would often be part of making covenant. And in fact, you see God going through these steps with people in the Bible. And what's amazing is we see Jesus going through those same steps with his disciples in the New Testament as he's inaugurating this new covenant that he's making with people. And so today, though, like I said, I just wanted to focus a little bit on the exchange of robes, belts, and weapons, just because for me, I thought, I had in my heart it could give some practical tools, I think, for maybe how we can experience this covenant relationship with God, how we can be assured of Jesus' covenant relationship with us, but also give us some practical ideas of how we can bless Jesus' heart in that relationship, because it's a two-way relationship. He's an immense source of blessing for us and a joy to be in a relationship and fellowship with, but we can also really bless and his heart as well. So Part of the covenant ceremony was covenant partners, when they were making all this agreement together, is they would exchange often robes, belts, and weapons, and this was a symbolic act. And actually a good example of this is in 1 Samuel 18. And you see David, King David, at the time he wasn't king, but you see David entering into covenant with Jonathan. So that's King Saul's son, so the heir to the throne. So it says, when David, in 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 to 4, it says, when David had finished speaking to Saul, so King Saul, so the soul of Jonathan, so Saul's son, was bound to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then in verse 3 it says, then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David. He took off his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt, and he exchanged these things. So it's just a little kind of sentence that we can see in the story between Jonathan and David, but I think it helps give us an idea of that covenant relationship that they had. And like I said, I think it's going to give us some keys to the kind of covenant relationship Jesus wants to have with us. And we are, in fact, in covenant relationship with Jesus. When we said to Jesus, I give you my life, this is actually very covenant language. It's the idea of walking through the blood. We recognize and we receive that Jesus gave his life for us, just as he promised he would. But it's also saying, Jesus, I give you my life. I give you all of me. And so it's actually a very covenant language when we talk about these things with our relationship with Jesus. So Jonathan is essentially offering to David his position and authority in the kingdom of Israel. So what would happen was Jonathan, he was the prince, so he would be wearing these princely robes, and David was not. So David was wearing kind of shepherd robes, or maybe the robes of a warrior in the army. And so when Jonathan gives to David this robe, basically from that point on, anyone who would see David, they would see him wearing maybe a purple or blue robe, as often royal robes were. They would say, they didn't have Facebook and all these things, or social media back then, so that people wouldn't necessarily know what Jonathan looked like, but they would know who he was based on what he was wearing. And so when Jonathan gives these robes to David, from that point on, if anyone sees David, they would think he was not a shepherd, not a warrior, but they would think he was a prince. They would think he was the heir to the throne. And so when Jonathan made this covenant with David, he was giving up his own right to the throne and conferring it onto David. It was a pretty big deal. And David, in turn, would exchange robes with Jonathan, and then people would think, who is this guy? And so I want you to think about this, because when we read passages in the Bible that says, clothe yourselves with Christ, or you have been clothed in Christ, or when you see passages in like Philippians 2 where it says, even though Jesus was equal to God, he did not consider equality with God as something to be taken, but he took on the very nature of a human. It's this covenant thing that's going on there. He took on our human clothes, in a sense. He clothed himself like a man. And instead, and in exchange, he gave us this, heavenly princely robe that he confers upon us. And it's an amazing thing if you think about it. It's such a humble an act of humility on Jesus' part, but an act to show his commitment to us. In covenant, he says, listen, I'll take off my robe and I'll place it on you. Now when people see you, they're going to see Christ. They're going to see me. And with that comes a certain authority. With that comes a certain capacity to be able to speak into things, to be able to represent all that the throne of heaven means. And so we have this authority, and so Paul talks about in some of his letters, in one of his letters, that we are ambassadors of Christ. So this is the idea of the exchange of robes that's going on. And in exchange, we gave Jesus our human robes, our dirty, sinful robes. And that was what he took to the cross, in a sense. That's what he wore with him to the cross. And there's a beautiful prophetic passage in Zechariah which talks about this high priest named Jesus, or Joshua, and how he was clothed in filthy rags. He took on our filthy rags and died in those rags, but was raised to honor and life again. Now there was also the exchange of armor and belts. That was symbolic of a man's strength and his weaknesses. And so when Jonathan traded those things with David, he was saying, I give to you my strengths. My strengths will be for your service. And I will take on your weaknesses. I will be for you, and I will defend you, and I will strengthen you. And so in the same way, we think about passages where it says, I can give thanks in any and every situation because in all things, it's Christ who strengthens me. It's this idea of him exchanging armor, his belt, his strength with us. And in exchange, he takes on willingly, our weaknesses. He comes and he takes on our sin, it said. He takes on our transgression. This is how committed he is in the relationship to us. And then we can rejoice in the fact that his strengths become our own. And so it talks about all over the New Testament how we are strengthened in Christ and how he strengthens us. And then there was the exchange of weapons. Now this is a wonderful thing as well, as they would exchange weapons. Jonathan was telling David, he gives him his sword and his bow, he said, I'm vowing to fight your battles for you. Symbolically, he was saying, I'm going to use my sword and my bow, and I'm going to fight your enemies. So your enemies will become my enemies, and your allies are going to become my allies. And in fact, that's exactly what Jonathan did. He defended David, even from his own father, at his own expense. And he fought for David, and he defended David. And it's what David did as well. David defended Saul, or Jonathan's family. He defended Saul, and he defended other people that were trying to even harm David, but he would not lay a hand on them, A, because he loved the Lord, but also because he had entered into this covenant relationship with Jonathan. He said, my priorities have changed. I'm going to defend your family and you, just as I believe you're going to defend me and my family. And so it completely changed their priorities. The people who were supposed to be David's enemies, so King Saul, who was trying to kill him, now became someone that David was seeking to defend out of love and covenant relationship with Jonathan. And so, we can see in the Bible too, there's, in the New Testament, there's a few things that can help with that as well. And so maybe you're familiar with these passages as well, but it talks about how in Ephesians 6, verses 10 to 18, it talks about the armor of God. So we're to put on the weapons and the armor that we have received from Christ in exchange for what we have. And his weapons are different. They're not what we'd expect. They're things like prayer. There's things like righteousness. They're things like faith. And the weapons that we have, that we use sometimes to defend ourselves or even to hurt others, unforgiveness, vengeance, bitterness, we exchange these things with Christ. And instead, he clothes us in his armor. He gives us his weapons to fight his battles and to defend those he loves. And so we start thinking about, well, who are those he loves? Well, it says he loves the whole world. So our battle is not against flesh and blood, like Paul talks about. We've exchanged, in exchanging these weapons with Jesus, we've also exchanged our enemies. We've exchanged our allies. Jesus' allies become our allies. So our battle is no longer against flesh and blood. And so we seek to defend and build up and care for those who he loves. And so we do that through prayer. We can do that through just showing kindness. We can do that through loving one another. And so there's this beautiful covenant relationship that Jesus has with us, and we've entered into it with him, and sometimes, at least for me, I don't always realize what that meant. And so for me, it's been a really exciting discovery to deep into covenant more and more and more, and I would love to talk with you about it more and more, and if ever you guys want to, you can give me a call, or we can email, and Samuel has my number and such. But I just wanted to share that with you guys, that you might be more assured in the fact that Jesus has your back. He's really for you.